Thank you very much, Madam President. Good morning to you all. My name is John Ruggie. I used to be somebody. High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to see you all here. It's an extraordinary turnout, nearly 1,000 people from 85 countries representing all sectors of society here for a common purpose, to share experiences with one another on the first 18 months of attempts and efforts to implement the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. We're thrilled that you chose to be here. We thank you for your engagement and for your commitment. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the members of the working group who have started a strong program to advance the implementation of the guiding principles, because at the end of the day, it's one thing to get principles adopted, it's another to turn them into reality on the ground, and they have an important role to play in that process. My task here this morning is to provide context for our discussions for the next day and a half, to essentially explain what the guiding principles sought to achieve and how, what some recent developments have been, and what lessons we can draw for the next part of the journey. And I'll do that by addressing four questions very briefly. Why were these guiding principles deemed necessary in the first place? What possessed us to spend 6 years of our life developing these guiding principles and then help persuade the Human Rights Council to endorse them, which they did unanimously, which, by the way, marked two firsts. The first was that this is the first authoritative guidance that the UN Human Rights Council or its predecessor body, the Commission, the first authoritative guidance that they had ever issued on the subject of business and human rights. Secondly, it was the first time that the Council endorsed any normative document on any subject that governments had not negotiated themselves. And my explanation for that is that the guiding principles by then had sufficient support from the key stakeholder groups, from business itself, from civil society, as well as many governments, that the Council in the end was happy to take the unusual step that they did. But what's it all about? Where have we come from, and where are we heading? Now, the idea that business enterprises should have human rights responsibilities that are independent of the legal requirements of the countries in which they operate is relatively new as an idea, in large part a byproduct of the most recent wave of globalization. Human rights and business became major issues on the international agenda in the 1990s. The liberalization of trade, domestic deregulation, and privatization throughout the world extended the scope and deepened the impact of markets. The rights of multinational corporations to operate globally increased greatly through, for example, more robust and enforceable rules protecting foreign investment and intellectual property. And that was all to the good. However, the protection of people in this transformed economic environment did not keep pace. Global governance gaps widened. These concerned workers' rights. It concerned issues of land acquisition. It concerned the impact of companies on sources of livelihood, on health, on the physical security of the person. History shows that stark imbalances between market forces and the fabric of societies is not sustainable. These imbalances must be rectified. Efforts to narrow governance gaps followed, including by the United Nations. In 2000, then Secretary General Kofi Annan launched the UN Global Compact as a platform for engaging the business community in support of universal values, as well as promoting and amplifying businesses' positive contributions to society's many needs. And I'm very proud to have been a key architect of the Compact, now the world's largest social responsibility initiative. But at the same time, globalization also put on the international agenda the challenge of dealing with the adverse consequences of business operations. My mandate as Special Representative was established in 2005 to address this issue in relation to human rights. It was clear to me that in a world of profit-maximizing firms and states jealously guarding their sovereignty, there would be no single or simple way of ensuring at the global level that individuals and communities are effectively protected against corporate-related human rights harm. There were two widely held illusions at the time that added to what was already a difficult challenge. One, that this aim is best achieved by seeking to subject the entire bundle of business and human rights issues into some overarching binding international legal instrument, and the other that voluntary initiatives and the identification of best practices will generate enough momentum for companies themselves to truly move markets. The problem is that neither of these approaches can deliver what it promises. The first, because it expects too much from the system of global public governance, and the second, because it permits too little. The successful expansion of the international human rights regime to encompass business enterprises must activate all the full array of rationales and institutional means that can mobilize and shape corporate conduct. And that, at the end of the day, is what the guiding principles seek to do. So how do they do that? Well, if you look around the world today, at the global level, corporate conduct is, broadly speaking, shaped by three distinct governance systems. The first is a system of public law and governance, both domestic and international. The second is what you might call a civil governance system involving stakeholders affected by business enterprises, employing social compliance mechanisms. And the third is corporate governance, which internalizes elements of the other two. In a nutshell, the guiding principles prescribe paths for strengthening and better aligning these three governance systems in support of the protection of human rights of those who are affected by corporate conduct. That's the idea behind the guiding principles. Simply put, states must protect, companies must respect, and those who are harmed must have redress. The guiding principles stipulate how. I think we will hear throughout this 2 days of discussion, including already this morning from some of our colleagues on the podium, examples of developments that have taken place since June 2011 of incorporating the guiding principles into various other international and national standard-setting bodies by businesses themselves, by civil society organizations, by workers' organizations, by industry associations, and by individual companies. Some of the examples include the new OECD guidelines, which for the first time have a human rights chapter. New provisions by Export Credit Agency to require adequate due diligence in return for public support. The new International Finance Corporation sustainability principles and performance standards, which address human rights issues much more explicitly and elaborately than ever before. We will hear from the European Union about the national implementation strategies its member states are developing. We will hear from representative of the United States government about what the U.S. is doing. We had this morning a meeting with a number of governments, including the government of Myanmar, about how the guiding principles can be applied to investment in Myanmar now that sanctions have been largely suspended. ASEAN has explored ways in which its own efforts in business and human rights can become aligned with the guiding principles, and the African Union is on a similar track. The guiding principles have also featured, as you may know, in a critical U.S. Supreme Court case, Kiobel v. Royal Dutch Petroleum, brought under the Alien Tort Statute, in which I filed an amicus brief. And so you see, across a wide array of sectors, a wide array of countries, efforts are underway to make good use of the guiding principles in order to achieve greater convergence, greater coherence, and above all, better protection for people on the ground where it matters most. We've arrived, I think, for the first time, it's fair to say, at a common platform, at a politically endorsed, politically authoritative platform for business and human rights, which provides a strong foundation on which to build. The job of building on it, of course, has only just begun. There's much to be learned from the experience already over the last year and a half or so, and the main purpose of this forum is to share those experiences, and I suspect that they may vary by sector, by industry. So let me touch here on only three broad issues that I would signal for global attention. The first concerns capacity building. Limited capacity, in my judgment, is a far greater obstacle to rapid progress in business and human rights than we tend to acknowledge. It's much easier to blame somebody than to build capacity. And yet, building capacity is the first and necessary step for making progress. Limited capacity affects the ability of all stakeholder groups, including governments, businesses, NGOs, and the UN system as a whole. The problem is particularly pronounced in relation to middle and lower income countries and small and medium-sized enterprises. Therefore, I welcome the recent decision by the Human Rights Council to explore the feasibility of establishing a capacity-building fund to promote implementation of the guiding principles, and also of the EU to develop more specific guidance for small and medium-sized enterprises. Capacity building is also ideal territory for collaborative action, both within and among stakeholder groups. But capacity building is not only a resource issue. Most companies still do a poor job of assessing and aggregating at corporate levels the costs to themselves of getting things wrong, which typically are simply rolled into local operating expenses, never attracting the attention of senior management, boards, or shareholders. Also, too many governments, as well as companies, do not yet fully appreciate how much of their own capacity gaps stem from poor internal coordination, where one unit creates problems that some other unit then has to try to cope with. So in short, the challenge here is not simply resource allocation, it is also institutional re-engineering. The need to focus on these issues is the first general lesson that I would draw for future work. A second lesson is directly related to the widespread uptake of the guiding principles by a broad array of actors. And that, of course, was precisely the hoped-for result. That's what we wanted to happen. But it also brings its own challenges. As time goes on, there is a risk that some of the coherence and the cumulative effect, the momentum provided by the guiding principles may diminish unless they are reinforced. But I believe that in our social media world, it should be possible to establish means of sharing up-to-date information in real time about major developments and trends, coupled with authoritative commentaries from time to time. Perhaps the working group, supported by the Office of the High Commissioner and external experts, could play such a role. My final observation concerns the further development of international law and the issue of extraterritorial jurisdiction. The research and consultations conducted under my mandate found that states are not generally required under international human rights law to regulate the extraterritorial activities of businesses domiciled within their jurisdiction. But nor are they generally prohibited from doing so, provided there is a recognized jurisdictional basis. Some UN human rights treaty bodies have been urging states to be more proactive. Now, governments themselves are increasingly adopting measures, domestic measures, with extraterritorial effects to help prevent corporate-related human rights harm abroad, as, for example, export credit agencies requiring companies to conduct human rights due diligence as a condition for public support. In addition, a growing number of national courts are agreeing to hear cases against companies for conduct by overseas affiliates because the company itself may have been negligent, either through omission or commission. These forms of extraterritorial jurisdiction are evolving rapidly at national levels as governments come to recognize that nothing less than the social sustainability of globalization itself is at stake, and they can't wait for someone else to deal with the challenges. But there is one area that requires more immediate international attention. National courts appear not to share a consistent understanding regarding the applicability to companies of international standards prohibiting gross human rights abuses, such as crimes against humanity. These may arise in areas where the human rights regime cannot possibly be expected to function as intended, such as conflict zones or similar sources of heightened risk. Typically, the allegations against companies involve corporate complicity in acts committed by related parties, such as security forces. Now, in those situations, plaintiffs may turn to home country courts. But even as the number of such cases has increased, courts have issued conflicting interpretation of what precisely the international standards stipulate and require. Greater legal clarity is needed for victims and companies alike, and only an intergovernmental process can provide that clarity. I therefore urge governments to consider undertaking such a process. The international community has determined, and everyone in this room would agree, that sovereignty can no longer serve as a shield behind which governments are allowed to commit or be complicit in the worst human rights abuses. Surely the same must be true of the corporate form. So let that be affirmed authoritatively and remove all doubt. My friends, my aim this morning has been to provide context. My task for the remainder of the forum is easy. It's to listen to you and to learn from you. So I'll get on with that now. Thank you very much again. And putting on my chairmanly hat, I give the floor to the chairman of the working group, Puvan Selvanathan.
Honorable Chair, Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished fellow working members, distinguished delegates and participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for me to be representing the working group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations and other businesses at this first annual forum on business and human rights this morning. I would like to extend a special welcome to Professor John Ruggie, the former Special Representative to the United Secretary General on the issue of human rights in transnational corporations and other business enterprises, to whom we owe the development of the guiding principles which lead our mandate, and thank him for undertaking the role of chair of this first annual forum. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to you, distinguished participants of the opening high-level session, to the representatives of member states, representatives of UN systems, international and regional organizations, national human rights institutions, trade unions, business associations and enterprises and non-governmental organizations, academics and other experts. The working group particularly welcomes the high participation of business representatives from all regions in this first annual forum. The working group also recognizes that member states and business representatives both have an essential and leading role to play in the implementation of the guiding principles, which today are the authoritative global standard for preventing and addressing adverse impacts on human rights arising from business-related activity. The guiding principles provide businesses with predictability in their operations and provide clarity on the obligations and responsibilities of all actors in their different roles in addressing and remedying those adverse impacts. When the Human Rights Council historically and unanimously endorsed the guiding principles in 2011, it also established our working group on business and human rights, and this forum on business and human rights under the guidance of the working group. Let me take this opportunity to clarify that this forum on business and human rights is a body established by the Human Rights Council independently of the working group. The purpose of this forum is to discuss trends and challenges in the implementation of the guiding principles and to promote dialogue and cooperation on issues linked to business and human rights, including challenges faced in particular sectors, operational environments, or in relation to specific rights of groups, as well as identifying good practices. In its role as guide to this forum, the working group has sought the support of OHCHR to gather expectations and ideas from stakeholders for the methodology and format of the first forum. My colleagues and I on the working group express our deep and sincere thanks to all of those who participated in the online consultation early in 2012, and more than 100 participants who attended the open consultation with stakeholders in May on the themes and methodology of this forum on business and human rights. Based on these consultations, the working group's vision is for the forum to serve as a venue to foster genuine exchange among stakeholders and collective learning, including for the working group, with a focus on identifying opportunities for dissemination and implementation in all regions, as well as the experience of different actors in implementing and applying the three pillars of the guiding principles. The working group has sought to ensure that the discussions at this forum contribute to the identification of solutions to challenges in this regard, including with regard to effective remedies for affected individuals and communities. And we turn this vision into the program of the forum. The working group has engaged with external facilitators selected on the basis of their specific expertise and their stake, their vested interest in this debate. In this regard, the working group wishes to express its gratitude for the efforts and contributions of the facilitators in designing the various sessions which are within the program. With regard to participation, we sought to ensure that there is broad and balanced participation of stakeholders at this forum, including states, businesses, civil society, affected individuals and groups, and other key stakeholders in the field of business and human rights. In addition, the working group plans to work closely with other key actors in the business and human rights field to maximize synergies and to ensure that the forum outcomes build and contribute to the effective implementation of the guiding principles and the broader business and human rights agenda at the global, regional, and national levels. The working group looks forward to being able to offer its reflections on the outcome of the forum at the end of the second day, and will provide guidance and our thoughts as to the way forward for all stakeholders and for the forum process leading to 2013 and beyond. I take this opportunity, as others have done, to express the working group's gratitude to the donors and partners who have contributed to enabling the organization of the forum, namely the government of Denmark, the government of the Netherlands, the government of Norway, the government of the Russian Federation, the government of Sweden, the government of Switzerland, and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Geneva. These contributions will, it is hoped, enable the forum to meet the high expectations of stakeholders, in particularly in promoting dialogue between all stakeholders towards the implementing of the guiding principles. Before I hand the floor to Professor Ruggie, the working group would also like to acknowledge the historic and groundbreaking role in moving the business and human rights agenda forward, approaching the subject through principled pragmatism, underpinned by rigorous research and evidence, and informed by extensive and inclusive consultation. Professor Ruggie managed to overcome decades of dogma and division and develop a framework that is both faithful to long-standing fundamental human rights norms and the principles, while also being innovative and responsive to the practical challenges and concerns of the stakeholders involved. The breadth of initiatives and activities that will be displayed during this forum, as well as the depth and scope of the thematic discussions which have been planned, are evidence of the impact of his work. The working group is looking forward to following the deliberations over the next 2 days, and we wish you a successful meeting. And before I hand the floor back to Professor Ruggie, I would like to invite you to join me in a smile. I'm smiling because I am happy that we are here, but I'm also smiling because, honestly, I'm both excited and a little nervous about what we will discover as we further open this door into the next phase of human rights. Government, civil society, and businesses working together as partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Selvanathan. We will now hear a number of keynote statements, the first of which is from the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Madam, you have the floor.